Nice job. Now you can stand back up, Donnie. I invite you up here, Jenny and Conrad. And I think I'm going to leave Gregor up there, and Gregor's going to be able to see the panelists. I'll spin you around at some point to see everybody else that's here, but about 70 or 80 people. And I think I'm going to hand the mic down to the middle here somewhere. And we've heard a lot of different things across the board, from the technical to the, heartfelt. I'd like to invite some questions. I will moderate and take down. Steve, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, actually, a few quick questions. One, in terms of Vancouver, is it possible to have a better comparative analysis on our ecological footprint to other cities with standard baselines? Because we leave a lot of things out. That's one question. The other one, I'm asking for Gregor about the Port of Vancouver. There's proposed coal export expansion. I'm just wondering, is that part of the pressure to get the coal off this continent? Because we're seeing the Surrey, there's a Surrey dock proposal coming up.
Yeah, I think everyone heard that. And good question. I'll repeat that, and I'll show. I think we can. I don't know. He could probably tell us whether we can hear it. It's good. It's good.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I switched another mic. So.
All right. Okay. So the question mostly to Gregor, but maybe also to Jenny, is around the question of the expansion of coal. Certainly, it's south of us in Bellingham. They're about to build a new big coal port, perhaps. We've got two coal ports in BC that are among the largest exporters. We also have two pipelines, one and a half, maybe two, and then another one coming, plus LNG exports. Is that a reflection of the decreased demand on this continent? Are we trying to get rid of all our junk?
There was one thing that was sort of alluded to but not mentioned. How about the demand of our overseers, the government, the ruling class, for more sustainable sources of income? That's really driving. They need more champagne and caviar.
No, more cars from China, more iPods or something. So we got to give them coal in exchange. Gregor, comments?
What you're seeing is a kind of a testing of the fence, if you will, by international coal companies. They have basically scouted most of the length of the Columbia River for sympathetic municipalities that would be willing to host a coal export facility. And as you might imagine, with slow growth here in the United States, we continue to have a number of people who are either in the ranks of the unemployed or underemployed, or we really don't have much wage growth. So far, a couple of these communities have said no because they don't really want an actual coal train coming through the community. But the coal companies have gotten more clever in terms of testing the boundaries here, and they've begun to offer up more complicated plans, like taking the coal down the Columbia River to a point that's east of Portland, and then keeping it on separate barges further down the Columbia River past Portland to a more sympathetic community. So I actually don't know what's going to happen in Vancouver, but we've had so much investment occur here in the Portland port area already for the export of potash, with new freight rail build-out and so forth, that I'm going to be very surprised if some municipality, doesn't eventually give the green light to a coal export facility. I just think it's going to be very difficult to halt that completely. Slow it down, yes. Halt it, I don't think so.
Possible follow-up question: will China still want it, or need it, or be able to choke it down?
Right, I can speak to that. So China's growth rate of coal consumption has come through its heroic supersized period. So 1998 to 2008 was this extraordinary moonshot of Chinese coal demand growth. Now, Chinese coal demand growth has slowed down considerably. However, it's at a slower rate, but from at a much higher level. And you know, one thing I tell friends of mine is watch India, because India is really going to decide, with so many millions of people still not on the power grid, the way that India goes is going to tell us a lot about where things go in terms of funding the global power grid next. It would be wonderful if India would just get all those 300 million people online using solar and wind. Will they do that, or will they use coal? I really encourage people to focus on India, because it's really going to be the pull on North American fossil fuel resources as we go ahead.
More questions? Warner? Yeah.
Hi, my question's for Jenny. Just a few things around what an ecologically productive hectare is and how that functions. I'm wondering when an ecological hectare is defined in terms of, you know, what, like it's each ecological hectare for Vancouver. I'm wondering if, like, that's saying that the ecological hectare, like every part of the productivity on the hectare is used to support, you know, one person. And then also too, in that, is it assuming stable state, or is it accounting for the dynamics of the natural world, like how things shift through time, like 1 year landslide, the subsequent 30 to 40 years successional regrowth.
Yeah. Okay, great questions, and I'll answer the other question as well. So if you just bear with me, so the previous question was, is there a way for ecological footprinting of cities to be commensurate so that the city footprints can be compared? And right now, my method is based on an urban metabolism study and bottom up, and it's not easy to compare it unless somebody else followed the method that I used. In Europe, they rely on input-output economic analysis, and there are many the component approach, and they're more comparable. But in North America, we don't have the same data statistics, so we do economic input-output analysis at the national level, but not at the city level. So it's much harder. So my method is a way that North American cities could pursue this question. So I guess it's still an evolving state at the city level. At the country level, the Global Footprint Network has done a very good job, I think, of providing national data. And in general, for urban countries, where 80% of the population is urbanized, generally you can use the national data as a proxy for the city if you wanted to. The problem with the top-down data is it doesn't give the city, the policy people, the look into the black box to see what they're doing with their policy and how that's affecting or could affect their ecological footprint. So then you go back to my method, which is the urban metabolism bottom up. Now, to get to your questions, you may have to remind me a few of them, but for the first one is the global hectare. And is it one person fully utilizing 1 hectare? Okay. Yes. Yes. Yes, it is. The global hectare metric is, they are not shared. So you cannot double count. If you're using a global hectare for consumption of wood, you cannot count that same global hectare for sequestration of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. If you are doing agroforestry and you're producing agricultural products in the same location where you're also harvesting wood, again, they would not be counted the same. So there is some debate around that. But what the footprint is meant to show is your demand, and so two people can't both utilize fully the ecological productivity of the same global hectare. Coffee, yeah, agricultural product. No, that's right. And the second question that you had for the flux
in ecological productivity. So what the Global Footprint Network does is they measure that flux every year. So I did my study based on 2006 data. I started that study actually in 2006, but I couldn't get the numbers for that year until 2009. And right now, you still can only get 2009 numbers. It takes the Global Footprint Network a couple of years to figure out what the total ecological state is, because it's always a retro. You have to look back and say, how did we do in that year? So they do account for it, and they account for it through what's called an equivalence factor. So it's very technical, but if you do ecological footprinting, you look at the total actual hectares that are being consumed, and then you multiply it by the global equivalence factor, which is a reflection of the productivity of that land type globally against all the other productivity of other land types globally just for that year. So it is accounting for flux, but it does it in 1 year snapshots retrospectively, right? So I couldn't do a 2013 ecological footprint probably till 2015, 2016.
Are there any estimates, because from my perspective, if you're only measuring, say, board feet, yet you could potentially have all those other factors in there, is there any estimate to how much that discrepancy could actually be?
I don't know what it is, but there is a whole world of ecological footprinter people and journal literature around this stuff, and there is an active debate around real hectares, real production, global hectares. So you'd have to get into those discussions.
Footprint. So what I mean by that is that ecosystems, intact ecosystems that aren't necessarily being used directly to produce things for humans, like wood from a forest or energy from a forest or carbon sequestration, are providing other kinds of services that we depend on nonetheless, like a forest is essential to our hydrological cycle, for example. And I'm wondering whether that's also included somehow in the measure of the ecological footprint.
No, it's not. So the ecological footprint is always an underestimate.
Only counting the resources that you actually consume or the energy reflected as land, forested area to sequester carbon dioxide emissions only. So it's always an underestimate. It does account for 12% of biocapacity set aside for nature, which we know isn't sufficient, but it does account for that, but that's the only thing it counts for. Probably much more, yeah.
Conrad, I'm waiting to hear the answer why efficiency to our environmental woes, because I think what I heard from Gregor say that in California they're in a no-growth or slow-growth state of the United States is. And one of the ways out of that for what I heard Gregor say was to look at our cities and look at more efficient ways to move people and public transit and using older infrastructure that is already there and using it more effectively. So it sounds like he's arguing the efficiency is the answer to our green future, and so I'd like to know why that's not the case.
Well, yes, you're right. There is the difference. Sometimes it can be a little confusing to figure out how the efficiency rebounds in an economy, because it doesn't necessarily have to rebound exactly in that same area. It can be anywhere. A lot of the idea with revitalizing and making a city more livable is that you can promote some type of growth in selling new properties. You can appeal to a wealthier clientele moving in. It's still about encouraging consumerism. You see, basically, if efficiency rebounds into consumerism, you just got a bigger problem. And, well, that's what I'm saying. No, there's only one kind of efficiency. It's labor efficiency. It's labor efficiency. It doesn't matter, even when you think that you're talking about resource efficiency, it's not, because resources are still used inevitably by humans using them in consumption or manufacturing. And the basic concept is efficiency puts a mandate on the economy, which is either you grow or you face rising unemployment, like United States at the moment. It is in a slow growth state because of a lot of the efficiencies that have been introduced. After the Great Depression, there have been new ones. The biggest efficiency at the moment that's affecting the world economy is the internet. The internet is probably just as devastating as any type of coal mine or tar sands operations. You see, the internet. Now if you want to go shopping, you just type on the internet, Amazon or eBay, and you can get your products mailed to you. Previously, you had a labor cost in people having to build shopping malls, people having to staff them, sales clerk. You see, people lose their jobs because of an efficiency. That efficiency, there's nobody going to say, oh, well, we got rising unemployment, that's great. People are trying to find new ways to encourage consumerism to deal with the efficiency. And inevitably, it rebounds into growth.
I think Conrad himself actually provides the best example I've heard of this phenomenon, this deceptive simplicity about efficiency shifting. So from what I know of the story, Conrad used to drive a car, and then he shifted over to a bicycle, and so he thought, I'm doing the right thing. Then what he discovered was that the amount he was saving in his income was then going to, in his disposable income, was going into greater consumption in other forms that actually outpaced, in terms of his overall footprint, the gains that had been made from shifting over to a bicycle from a car. It's one of those fundamental things where it's so easy to greenwash if we don't look at financial inequity. And on this point, it's worth noting that Vancouver has the highest income per capita postcode in the whole of Canada, and also has the lowest income per capita postcode in Canada. The Gini coefficient here, as Randy suggested to me, could well be close to 1. It's 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 a very inequitable city, and the inequity comes in when you look at these efficiency shiftings and you ask questions about what's happening in a space that ultimately wants to continue driving consumerism underneath its system, because it thrives on that very process.
At 5 o'clock in LA, probably faster to drive, depending on where you're going. But in most cities, and there's some exceptions to this, in most cities, public transit is slower. Public transit has a driver. It is therefore less efficient for you as a rider, and has more labor associated with it, because you have a driver. I mean, you might share them with 400, 500 people, or her with 400 or 500 people, but it's a less efficient situation. It fits Conrad's model of moving something actually less efficient in terms of our time, in terms of the additional labor needed to get you to where you're going. But at the same time, I think we're better off with that, and I think it squares it well.
Are you seriously saying that transit is less efficient than driving a car? I get your point.
Well, you got an extra driver, you got an extra person, absolutely.
But you don't have a fleet of people building cars for every individual.
Actually, it depends.
Building
If you own a car anyway, it depends.
It's the labor piece, right?
But what you're arguing is that to have a society where people get around by bus is less efficient than a society where everyone has their own metal box. That doesn't make any sense.
It actually does. Actually, a good example of this is the city of Vienna used to run on light rail entirely, beautiful light rail system. They moved to a subway system. They're now employing far less people actually far less people in the system, because they can carry more people per train essentially now, because they're underground, they're going faster, and they've become a much more efficient, but also probably a much less livable place because of that. But I don't want to carry the thing too far, but obviously there's some question. Transit, how many people are really on the bus, on the average bus? Probably 5 or 6 people, maybe 10 on average. Your rush hour is 50.
Poorly used transit with private cars.
It just is, right. on average, throughout the day. You got to have transit going pretty often on. You're going to have maybe 10 people on a bus. You have an extra person.
If I could, Randy, could I just say one thing about the rebound effect? Just very briefly, it's possible. So first of all, the rebound effect is a very fertile intellectual ground. One could have lots of legitimate viewpoints about it. I would say this: it's possible that the problematic secondary effects of the rebound effect during the cheap fossil fuel era, during the cheap oil era, were clear. Now we're rebounding to a lower level of growth. We're perhaps rebounding, but we're rebounding to different energy sources, and renewables are becoming more substantial. So in a low growth domain, it's much harder to find the negative aspects of the rebound effect.
Oh, question over here. Yeah. Come right first. Okay.
Efficiency doesn't rebound to a low state. The rebound is when you come back from that, when you start consuming more.
Right.
And renewables, well, you have to look at renewables. Green miracle. But the actual fact, the end result, no, they weren't. Probably the single most devastating thing that and if you are using it to build more highways, more homes, more ships, more anything you want, you've got a bigger problem. Anytime we humans think we can overcome the negative feedback in the system, we are sorely mistaken. Well, those are the parts I like. But there are solutions actually quite simple. Once you understand the problem, once you understand the problem and you put it in the context of efficiency, and you get it away from the idea of, oh, we need to make everything more efficient, and look at how you deal with the efficiency that's already in the system, solutions are a lot easier. Any time that you employ people in the system where they're not producing something, you are reducing your ecological footprint. If you take somebody who, more people employed in healthcare, have somebody chat to, instead of treating patients like assembly line, time to talk to them. You're creating value, you're improving your society, but you're not producing more, and you're creating employment. The idea is, instead of rebounding that efficiency into more consumerism, rebound it into things that'll make us all happier. Rebound it into education. Instead of one teacher for 30 students, hey, what about one teacher for 15? You're creating employment that's not rebounding into consumerism. The best way we can all reduce our ecological, well, the best way is, organic farming. Organic farming is amazing because you have more people employed to produce a particular output. You're employing people that is not rebounding into more growth. And there's a great story I could tell about that, but there's probably not enough time.
But I was thinking about how you were describing efficiency and our historical background. And I was wondering if you ever put some time into thinking about 500 years of Western colonization, expansion, and contraction, and how it's changed from being a geographical colonization to more of a economic colonization that's on the wane, and we fear perhaps that Asia is going to reverse that process. Have you, like I said, this may be a distraction, but have you considered that what we now call globalization over a 500-year period? Because the effect of production in the role of some colonies was to be the production of the origin of raw materials, but not the consumption. There are places in Africa which continue to be impoverished materially. And yet they're happier sometimes in some measures, like the particular.
There's a lot I'd love to talk about that.
Look, I didn't realize that was really addressed to me, so I'll just use that to segue a little bit, perhaps, because I think looking at a 5 history, that's an interesting time frame because it was roughly that the development of interest-based loans actually emerged, and we actually moved into a very different understanding of profit. I mean, in history, across cultures 500 years ago, there was an understanding that greed, avarice, all these sorts of things was actually not something to be considered socially desirable. And then we shifted, and we've been in this same mode for the last 500 years. And from what I understand, looking at economic systems, 500 years is about the amount of time that an economic system usually lasts. So let me tell you what I think ties in with the solution question here and this question of globalization, because you're right. The shift, there's no longer the base there that's going to drive the industrial production much longer for the Chinas and Indias and Brazils of the world, because who's actually going to be the producers behind that, because it was part of that colonization process. The future, whether we like it or not, is a post-growth future, and it's one in which privatization of profit will disappear. Let me explain that in more technical sense. The notion of a company that has shareholders that profit from dividends is coming to an end. And it's coming to an end because not-for-profit equivalents, so companies that exist like Mozilla, like Bupa in the health area, like BRAC in Bangladesh, that employ people within a not-for-profit framework and run enterprises, in BRAC's case, dairies, bakeries, craft stores. Not-for-profit enterprises, so not charities, these are not-for-profits that have enterprise models behind them. When you compare them to the equivalent for-profit company with shareholders in most cases, the not-for-profit in terms of finance, human resources, in terms of actual real value that they're creating, in terms of market trust and all these sorts of things, the not-for-profits are going to outcompete the equivalent for-profits. It's happening already. Not-for-profit enterprises on the rise. It's going to continue to happen. It's to Conrad's point about going out and setting up organic farms and employing people in that way. I just add, make sure it's a not-for-profit organic farm. And so the exciting things for Vancouver, because I want to come back to this, I think we've really skirted around this issue of financial inequity as the fundamental driver of unsustainability. It does that by creating social stratification, status envy, then overconsumption through either necessity in people's situations, in impoverished situations, and also through that status envy in other situations. And that, in turn, is what is driving this overconsumption here. And it's part of any system that centralizes wealth and power. So it didn't matter if it was communism, capitalism, or capitalism in its various strands, philanthrocapitalism, green capitalism, you name it. If it centralizes wealth and power, which all those systems do, you will continue in an unsustainable trajectory, especially given we're 30 years past overshoot. And so there's the feedback loops in place now. It's too late to look to technology and efficiency to save us. It's an important part of it, and yes, I believe that people should be using public transport systems more often, because then the efficiencies also change as well in terms of making those things more viable. But essentially, the era here needs to be one, and luckily is one, of the end of the privatization of profit, and associated with that, with the maintenance of taxation systems, philanthropy, we will see a return towards financial inequity. Thank God, because that is our hope. A more equal world is our hope for a sustainable world. A less equal world, and we are right now at the most unequal point in history in terms of financial inequity globally. 60% or 80% of people worldwide live in countries where financial inequity is increasing. That is going to turn around in part because of resource shortages, and in part because of the internet and what it's doing in terms of leveling the playing field and allowing not-for-profit enterprise to rise and outcompete equivalent for-profit enterprise. So I think that is where the real hope lies, in what's happening with Islamic banking and non-interest-based loans, what's happening in the rise of peer-to-peer production, distributed manufacturing, the rise of volunteering, the rise of purpose-driven motivation, as Daniel Pink points to, the rise of the empathic civilization, as Jeremy Rifkin talks about. We are returning now, after a long period of individualism, to a collectivism that is going to have a rebound effect of itself into financial equality, thankfully, because we sure as hell need it.
Gregor McDonald, I don't believe we're going to go where Donnie is suggesting easily. We're in a critical phase because we're 5 times our Earth carrying capacity. How likely is it we're going to get down to 1 without a catastrophe, and what do you suggest, and what are the ways we're going to do it?
I had trouble hearing the question. It was muffled.
Yeah, so how we're in a crisis. We are between 3 and 5, or who knows how much overshoot. It's hundreds of percent. How can we quickly move to a place where we're actually going to be able to keep this earth and stay on it? The empathic cultural changes may take some time. Is I think John suggested. How can we move a little faster than that?
Well, just briefly, I mean, one of the dynamics that I see that's a bit of a surprise is that slow growth is actually turning out to be not quite so bad as feared. In fact, there's actually a lot of good things that are happening in the slow growth domain. It's not the case for the 5 billion people in the developing world who are growing at a faster rate, but at least for the 2 billion people in the developed world, we're barely growing, and yet we're building out, we're building out new transportation systems and renewables, albeit from a very low base. So that's a big question to kind of answer, but I'll take a shot at it, and that is my hope is that we actually span the low growth domain. As painful as that is, it's actually kicking off a number of unexpected benefits, but unfortunately, there's a number of other things like the income inefficiency and the Gini coefficient here in this country that Donnie was mentioning in Vancouver. Gini coefficient here in the United States is skyrocketing. It's very concerning. So, I mean, I'm reluctant to give a hopeful outlook, but I would like to identify slow growth as one dynamic, one trend that is kicking off benefits.
On the same topic, if I could just ask, Japan's probably a good example. 20 years in recession, they've had negative growth for over 20 years now. They also have among the highest debt levels in the world. And do we end up in a debt trap if we can't grow ourselves out of it? How do we get out of that?
I think there are strong indications that Europe and the United States are already moving down the same path that Japan started. Japan's the leader in this regard. It moved into its slow growth phase. It generated debt to maintain a low level of consumption. And again, it's very difficult to find a positive outcome there. I'm struggling to, Japan may build as much as 8 or 9 gigawatts of solar this year. As I reach up to grasp for something positive, then it comes to mind.
Okay, Jenny.
So I generally agree with the discussion and everything that's being said here. And to my mind, what's resonating is you all may recall about the limits.
Fundamentally, the argument about the rebound effect and how technology innovation in a paradigm of growth can never solve our problems because all we do is reconsume and bump up against the next limit that we technologically innovate a solution to, call it efficiency, where we then reconsume and bump up again. That was the fundamental argument. And although many critics will say, oh, that's totally been dismissed, actually it hasn't. It's bang on with the consumption and predictions of where we're going for a global collapse, probably by the end of this century or near the latter part of this century. And so I think that we really need to get serious about sustainability. And I'd really strongly encourage us to be thinking about post-growth. A very good book by Howard Odum and Elizabeth Odum, A Prosperous Way Down. This concept of planning down, like beginning to think about where is labor going? Why do we tax labor and not consumption? Why don't we reverse that a bit? What can we do? We are intelligent beings. We can see the trends. There are changes in regulations, changes in the tax system, moving towards steady state economy. Remember, development is getting better, growth is getting bigger. Growing is not synonymous with getting better, and that was the fundamental mistake we made years ago. And it's so entrenched in our mind that growth is good, but they are not the same thing. So all we need to do is become articulate and active. And this is a highly intelligent group, obviously, from the conversation we're having. So I think that there are recipes, groups, ways of knowing to solve these problems. Let's start this dialogue.
Majority of people, if you say degrowth to them, they look at you and they wonder if you should be checked into a facility or something. And we can't even start the conversation.
But we're collapsing. We are collapsing, right? Like
now has said he was totally surprised by 2008, didn't anticipate these things. Bill Reese, on the other hand, and many ecologists, many steady state economists have been anticipating things, and nobody listens to them. They're crazy, but guess what? Their paradigm's more robust. So I think it's starting to change. Like, I think we're getting into the crisis where the people who think we're crazy might start seeing what's the Kuhn's theory of revolution, scientific revolution, is it's not working anymore. It's not going to work any better in the future.
I'm going to actually suggest somewhat the opposite. I say it's time to actually put the doom and gloom stuff on hold for a while and start with the strengths. Start with the things that make people move into their heart space and go, wow, I'm already part of that. I'm already part of the collaborative consumption movement. I'm already part of the sharing economy in my local area. I do already care about this thing and that thing. And then lay over the top the overshoot issue. I mean, that's in part what Transition Town did to some extent, and it's been such a successful movement worldwide, is said, let's form together, and the first thing they do is they hold almost a party. And then, once you've connected on the human level, and this is what we found with the Hawkesbury River Community Directory, connect as humans, and then lay in the rationale for why you're doing it. Like Conrad knows, you throw a party, people will come. And then you can throw in the messages over the top of that. But I think it is critical from Grant Turner's work in Australia. It's actually 2050 that we're going to see full ecosystems collapse on the middle track of the limits to growth updated data. So this is really with what's working. And I just want to pick up one point here that I think is worth more discussion. I think most people get it wrong in terms of the economics of this and what they look at actually changing. The common approach, particularly from progressive or heterodox economists, is actually put taxes on the bads. Here's why I think that is actually a poor decision. Because if you tax consumption and you take away taxes for labor, what happens? Well, the wealthiest people, as far as I understand it worldwide, the wealthiest people don't actually have big consumption habits themselves. They run companies that they then outsource that consumption through. So taxing their consumption might reduce their company's profits, but they're still running those companies essentially and still bringing in income in this for-profit world as long as it goes on and ekes out the last bits of profits. So I don't see a tax on consumption bads actually forcing fast enough a wealth redistribution that we need here. That's what progressive taxation is meant to do. Now, we know there's lots of problems in terms of tax havens, especially for company taxes, but also in terms of individuals. I say we need to look more at how you actually redistribute wealth rather than looking at how we actually address the carbon footprint problem. I think the second one is going to be a follow-on from the first, because the first actually drives the overconsumption in the first place.